Passengers thought he was just another kind-hearted bus driver who remembered their names and always waited for late runners. But when armed men turned his bus into a weapon, they learned that some guardians never really stop protecting people, no matter how different their assignment becomes. Welcome to True Human Tales. Before we begin this powerful story of hidden service and protective instincts, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These moments of quiet heroism deserve to be remembered. Route 47 wound through downtown Chicago like a lifeline for the city's most vulnerable residents, connecting senior housing complexes, medical centers, and community services that elderly citizens depended on for daily survival. The route served neighborhoods that younger residents rarely visited, carrying passengers who relied on public transportation by necessity. Frank Sullivan had been driving Route 47 for 7 years, though his passengers simply called him Driver Frank. He was 64 years old, with silver hair, kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled, and the patient demeanor that made nervous elderly riders feel completely safe in his care. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson," Frank would call out as his most regular passenger climbed the steps with her walker. "How's that grandson of yours doing in college? Still getting good grades thanks to you asking about him every day," she'd reply with a smile. Frank knew every regular passenger by name, remembered their medical appointments, asked about their grandchildren, and always waited those extra seconds for runners trying to catch the bus. He carried hand warmers in winter and extra water bottles in summer. The elderly passengers trusted Frank completely. They'd specifically wait for his bus because they knew Driver Frank would help them with heavy bags, ensure safe seating, and announce stops clearly. "Frank's an angel," said Dorothy Williams, who'd been riding Route 47 for 5 years. "He makes us feel like we matter." What Dorothy and his other passengers didn't know was that Frank Sullivan had spent 22 years with the United States Secret Service, the last 8 as a presidential detail specialist responsible for protecting the nation's highest officials. What they didn't know was that the gentle bus driver who helped them navigate city transportation had once been entrusted with protecting the most powerful person in the world. Frank had retired from Secret Service 7 years ago after a traumatic incident involving a presidential security breach that had cost him 2 fellow agents. The guilt and stress had driven him to seek peace in work that involved protecting people in simpler, more direct ways, and he'd found healing in serving the community's most vulnerable residents. Thursday afternoon started like every Thursday for the past 7 years. Frank arrived at the depot at 1:30 p.m. for his afternoon shift, conducting his pre-route inspection with attention to detail he'd once applied to presidential motorcade security. Vehicle condition, communication systems, emergency equipment, habits from his Secret Service days, where thoroughness meant the difference between success and tragedy. He began his route at 2 p.m. sharp, picking up passengers from the Riverside Senior Center returning from weekly grocery shopping. Frank knew each passenger's routine, their preferred seating, their mobility limitations. "Afternoon, Mr. Chen," Frank said as a 76-year-old gentleman slowly boarded with his cane. "How did the physical therapy go today?" "Much better, thanks for asking," Mr. Chen replied gratefully. Frank helped secure Mr. Chen's shopping bags and ensured he had a seat close to the front. This level of personal attention wasn't required by city transit policy, but Frank's background in VIP protection had taught him that true security meant caring about every detail. As the bus filled with elderly passengers returning from medical appointments and social activities, Frank fell into his familiar rhythm. Smooth acceleration and braking, clear announcements, patient waiting for passengers who moved slowly. Frank's enhanced awareness never fully shut off. Even in this peaceful environment, part of his mind automatically tracked traffic patterns, noted unusual behaviors, monitored for potential threats. 22 years of Secret Service training had made situational awareness as natural as breathing. What passengers saw was a dedicated bus driver who took exceptional pride in serving seniors. What they didn't realize was that Frank Sullivan was one of fewer than 500 people in the United States with his level of training in executive protection. At 3:07 p.m., Frank was helping an elderly woman with her groceries when he noticed something that triggered his Secret Service instincts. A dark sedan had been following his route for the past 3 stops, maintaining tactical distance and matching his speed patterns. Nothing suspicious to civilian observation, but unmistakable to someone trained in counter-surveillance. Frank continued his normal routine, while his awareness shifted into a mode he hadn't accessed in 7 years. His driving remained smooth and professional, but every protective protocol had quietly activated. The sedan's occupants, their positioning, their communication patterns, details that painted a picture Frank didn't like. "Next stop, Mercy Hospital," Frank announced calmly, watching the sedan through his mirrors. 2 occupants, driver maintaining perfect following distance, passenger side window partially down despite cool weather. Professional surveillance or preparation for action. At the hospital stop, 3 passengers boarded, 2 elderly women and a middle-aged man Frank didn't recognize. The stranger's body language was wrong, too alert, too aware, scanning the bus interior with tactical precision rather than looking for an available seat. Frank's enhanced pattern recognition, developed through years of threat assessment, caught micro-expressions and movement patterns that most people would miss. This wasn't a normal passenger. This was someone with training, conducting reconnaissance. The man chose a seat with optimal sight lines and positioning for control of the bus interior. Frank made mental notes while maintaining his friendly driver persona, but his Secret Service training was screaming warnings. At 3:15 p.m., everything changed. The dark sedan pulled alongside the bus at a red light, and Frank saw muzzle flashes through the passenger window. Not shooting at the bus, shooting out traffic cameras and emergency call boxes, systematic elimination of communication and surveillance infrastructure. Frank's transformation was immediate but invisible. 22 years of protective training overrode 7 years of peaceful routine in a heartbeat. This wasn't random street crime. This was a coordinated operation, and his bus full of vulnerable elderly passengers was the target. Frank's Secret Service training took over with deadly precision. He assessed the tactical situation in seconds. 1 hostile inside the bus, at least 2 more in the following vehicle, elderly passengers who would be unable to evacuate quickly, limited maneuvering options in downtown traffic. The man on the bus revealed a concealed weapon and moved toward the front, confirming Frank's threat assessment. "Nobody move," the gunman announced. "This bus is now under our control." Frank's hands remained steady on the steering wheel, but his mind was running through protective protocols that had once safeguarded world leaders. Vehicle dynamics, escape routes, threat neutralization options, civilian protection strategies, calculations that happened faster than conscious thought. "What do you want?" Frank asked calmly, his voice carrying none of the fear his passengers were feeling. "Just drive where I tell you," the gunman replied, pressing his weapon against the head of Mrs. Patterson, Frank's most vulnerable regular passenger, "and nobody gets hurt." Frank's blood went cold. In his rearview mirror, he could see 23 elderly passengers, most in their 70s and 80s, looking to him for protection. The same protective instincts that had once driven him to step between presidents and bullets now focused entirely on the people under his care. "Easy," Frank said, his voice carrying authority that made the gunman pause slightly. "I'll drive wherever you want. Just keep everyone calm." Frank began following the gunman's directions while his tactical mind worked through options. The Secret Service had trained him for exactly this scenario: vehicle-based hostage situations involving high-value targets. But instead of protecting 1 president, he was protecting 23 grandparents. The principles were the same. The stakes felt even higher. Frank drove through downtown Chicago following the gunman's directions, but his route choices weren't random. Every turn, every street selection was strategic, guided by training in evasive driving and tactical positioning that he'd learned protecting presidential motorcades. The gunman wanted to reach an isolated location where his Confederates could execute whatever plan they'd developed. Frank's job was to prevent that while protecting his passengers. His enhanced knowledge of the city, combined with Secret Service tactical training, gave him advantages the criminals didn't expect. "Take the next right," the gunman ordered, growing more agitated as Frank's seemingly compliant driving actually moved them toward more populated areas with better emergency response coverage. "Sure thing," Frank replied calmly, making the turn while positioning the bus where police response would be optimal. His passengers remained terrified, but alive, and Frank was determined to keep it that way. Through his radio system, Frank activated an emergency protocol he'd hoped never to use, a direct line to federal authorities that his Secret Service credentials had allowed him to maintain. This is Frank Sullivan, retired USSS Presidential Detail. Bus 4751 has been hijacked with armed hostiles and 23 elderly hostages, requesting immediate tactical response. The response was immediate. Frank Sullivan, this is Secret Service Command. We show you downtown on Route 47. Confirm your status. Frank's driving became more purposeful as he coordinated with federal response teams using protocols and codes that belonged to his previous life. His passengers didn't understand the calm competence in his voice, but the gunman was beginning to realize that something was wrong. "Why are we still in traffic?" the gunman demanded. "I said take us somewhere isolated." Frank's smile in the rearview mirror was gentle but carried steel. "Sorry, friend. I'm not that kind of driver." The gunman realized he'd severely underestimated the elderly bus driver when federal tactical vehicles began appearing in traffic around them. Frank's seemingly random route had led them directly into a perfectly coordinated law enforcement response. "What did you do?" the gunman snarled, pressing his weapon harder against Mrs. Patterson's temple. "Who are you?" Frank brought the bus to a controlled stop at an intersection where Secret Service and FBI tactical teams had optimal positioning. His parking choice wasn't random. It was textbook executive protection, creating the safest possible scenario for hostage extraction. "I'm a bus driver," Frank said calmly, making eye contact with the gunman in his mirror. "But I used to be other things." Frank's transformation was complete now. The gentle senior who'd been helping elderly passengers was gone, replaced by a Secret Service professional who'd spent 2 decades protecting the most important people in America. His voice carried command authority that made even hardened criminals pay attention. "Here's what's going to happen," Frank said with quiet confidence. "You're going to let these passengers off this bus safely. Then you and I are going to have a conversation with some federal agents who are very good at their jobs." The gunman looked around and realized his tactical situation had completely collapsed. Professional vehicles, trained agents, coordinated response. He was facing the kind of operation usually reserved for presidential security threats. "Those passengers are under my protection," Frank continued, his eyes meeting each of his elderly riders in the mirror. "And I take that very seriously." The resolution was swift and professional. Federal agents extracted the hostages with precision that spoke to Frank's coordination and tactical guidance. The elderly passengers were treated for shock, but remained physically unharmed, thanks to a bus driver who'd turned out to be much more than anyone had imagined. 2 hours later, Frank sat in a federal debrief room, providing tactical information to Secret Service and FBI investigators. Outside, his passengers were being interviewed by agents who couldn't quite believe that their beloved bus driver had once protected presidents. Special Agent Jennifer Martinez, Frank's former Secret Service colleague, reviewed the operation with professional admiration. Frank Sullivan, 22 years presidential detail, decorated for service above and beyond. "Why didn't you tell us you were driving buses in Chicago?" Frank looked through the window at his passengers, who were being reunited with worried family members. "Because they needed a bus driver, not a Secret Service agent. I wanted to help people get where they were going safely." "And today?" Frank's smile was tired, but satisfied. "Today they needed both." The investigation revealed that the terrorist cell had specifically targeted Route 47 because their intelligence suggested it carried vulnerable elderly passengers who would be easy to control and manipulate. They'd planned to use the bus and its passengers as leverage in a larger operation targeting federal facilities. They'd severely miscalculated the capabilities of the man driving the bus. The next morning, Frank returned to his Route 47 assignment at 2 p.m. sharp, just like he had every day for 7 years. The bus depot felt different now. News crews waited outside, federal agents conducted follow-up interviews, and transit officials looked at their senior driver with new understanding. But when the first passengers boarded at the Riverside Senior Center, they greeted Frank exactly the same way they always had. "Afternoon, Driver Frank," called out Mrs. Patterson, moving slowly with her walker. "Ready for another peaceful ride?" Frank helped her to her favorite seat, his voice carrying the same gentle patience. Always ready for you, Mrs. Patterson. That's what I'm here for. As more elderly passengers boarded, some mentioned seeing news reports about some excitement on Route 47, but most were more concerned with their grocery bags and doctor's appointments than federal investigations. Frank noticed that his passengers seemed more relaxed, more trusting. They didn't need to know the details of what had happened. They just needed to know that driver Frank would always get them home safely. Mrs. Chen approached the driver's seat hesitantly. "Frank, some people are saying you used to work for the government." Frank adjusted his rearview mirror and started the bus. "I've had different jobs, Mrs. Chen, but this is the one I like best." As Route 47 pulled away from the senior center, Frank realized something important. His passengers still saw him exactly the same way. To them, he wasn't a former Secret Service presidential detail specialist. He was just Driver Frank, the nice man who remembered their names and helped them navigate the city safely. That's exactly how he wanted it. Frank Sullivan continued driving Route 47 for 5 more years before retiring completely at age 69. The bus route he'd protected was eventually equipped with enhanced security systems in his honor, though Frank had insisted they keep the upgrades invisible to passengers. He never spoke publicly about his Secret Service career or the events of that Thursday afternoon. When reporters asked, he'd simply say that he was a bus driver who'd done his job. But his passengers knew better. They understood that driver Frank was the kind of person who would always stand between them and danger, whether it came from traffic accidents or something much worse. Sometimes heroes don't retire from service. They just find new ways to protect the people they care about. Sometimes the most dangerous person on the bus is the elderly driver with the patient smile and the perfect driving record, carrying skills and training that most people can't imagine. Frank Sullivan had tried to leave his protection days behind, but when terrorists threatened the vulnerable seniors who'd become his chosen family, he remembered that some callings never truly end. They just transform into new ways of serving. That's the most important route of all. So now I ask you, have you ever met someone like Frank? Someone who seemed like just a dedicated public servant until the moment they revealed the depths of their training and commitment? Someone whose quiet presence made you feel safer without knowing why? Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today, and share their story with us. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us make sure they are. We publish human stories that matter every single week. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story. And remember, sometimes the person driving your bus knows more about protection than you could ever imagine.